This is Eli Sagor with the University of Minnesota Extension in St. Paul. I'm down here in room 19 Green Hall on the University St. Paul campus for the fourth in our series of webinars offered this year. Extension is offering these in partnership with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative based at the Cloquet Forestry Center. I know we've got a broadcast site up at Cloquet as well as broadcast sites in Rochester and Duluth, Grand Rapids as well, and down here in St. Paul. So welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to have you here. Our topic today is a Minnesota Forest Health Update. We have a regular speaker in DNR Forest Health Specialist Jana Albers. Jana has presented several times here through our webinars over the years, and we're glad to have her back. We're going to start with Jana in just a moment, talking about what's in your woods right now, reviewing DNR Forestry's Aerial Forest Health Survey results from last year and what they expect this year. After that, we'll transition to my extension colleague, Angie Gupta, down in Rochester. Angie will talk about what's likely to be coming. We hear a lot about emerald ash borer, but there are some other bugs and various other things moving into our woods, and it's important to be aware of those and to know what to do if we see them. So it's a two-part presentation today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jana. I'm going to mute my mic, and Jana, you can take it away.
There we go. Well, thanks, Eli. I'm really glad to be here today and speaking to you about things that are near and dear to my heart. I'd like to thank Eli and Minnesota Extension for this opportunity also. Let's see. Oops. Can't get the screen to go. Just a minute, I have to go back. It's not advancing. There we go. Whoops. I guess I can do it, Eli. There you go. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to start out by having you look at the aerial survey results from last year. We had about 1.3 million acres with damage on it in Minnesota. Normally we survey 13 million acres of forest land with help from the U.S. Forest Service and DNR Resource Assessment. And our results are documented on our Forest Health webpage. And if you look at the box below that, you can see the publications area where I've circled annual reports and forest insect and disease newsletter. Right now, I think if you want to look at the 2013 results, you'd want to look at the January 2014 newsletter. It has a map for each significant causal agent found in 2013. Today, I am going to be using the map of the pests observed last year to talk about what to expect this year. Basically, I'm going to deconstruct this pest by pest. Also, down at the bottom of the page on the far right, you'll notice a web address. Pretty much for each pest, I have a web address, and I'm not going to be noting that when we do further talking pest by pest. So the first thing I want to talk about in the aspen, birch, oak, and basswood forests is the forest tent caterpillar. It's a native and widespread insect in North America. It's a cyclic defoliator. And since about the 1890s, the recorded outbreaks occur every 10 to 16 years in Minnesota. And today is the day that they hatch. Phenologically speaking, I don't think they're out there today. They're late. We really expect them when the aspen leaves break buds. So that's about when they normally come out. But on an average annual basis, today's the day. Oops. Here you see what the map of forest tent caterpillar, where we had 1.1 million acres of mostly very light defoliation. And if you skip down to the chart below, shows the last two outbreaks that we've had. And these are in millions of acres. So the peaks were 4 million and almost 8 million in these last two outbreaks. And then if you look out to the far right there, you can see 2013, where we were just sitting about 1 million acres. And so if you look at that, you can think that we're probably on the trajectory to another outbreak. However, looking at the egg mass surveys that we've been doing, we're really expecting more defoliation similar to last year. It's very, very spotty in terms of egg masses out there. So really, I think it's going to be more similar to last year than perhaps shooting up to some higher number. I'd also like to call your attention to the DNR Forest Health webpage. We have an extensive array of forest tent caterpillar information there, and you can see that in the browner box. We have identifying FTC life cycle management, and something that most homeowners and extension agents might be interested in is the homeowner tip sheet. 2 to 3 pages of really good ideas on how to deal with them. We also have information on outbreaks, impacts, and also predicting defoliation. We have the old method posted, but we also posted a new method over the winter here. And it uses trends in local observations last year to predict the likely FTC defoliation level for the upcoming summer. It's sort of a do-it-yourself method for a small acreage. So it's ideal for a lakeshore association, if they have a spray program, that sort of thing, and also for event planning like graduations, weddings, and reunions. My next causal agent is the two-line chestnut borer, and this is an insect that can only attack stressed oaks. It builds up during severe droughts like we've been having, or a drought and or plus FTC defoliation. When you have two-line chestnut borer going through and you've got multiple years of impact, the red oaks, then the white oaks, and then the bur oaks start dying. So what we really are suggesting this year, because we're having both drought and defoliation, we'd like you to wait for 1 to 2 years after this severe drought and drought plus FTC to do any thinning in an oak stand. This is going to prevent a lot of mortality in your oak stands that you're working in. The next causal agent I'm talking about is oak wilt. It's a non-native, but it's now naturalized in parts of Minnesota, and it's a fatal disease of oak. It has a limited distribution in Minnesota, and I'll show you a map on the next slide. The oak leaves discolor, wilt, and then fall. That's the basic scenario. But the red oaks die in one season. All the leaves fall suddenly in July, and you can see the 2 pictures there of the leaves. Some of them have been completely dried out, and some of them are just freshly fallen there. And the white oaks die much more slowly. You'll find expanding pockets of dead and dying oaks, with the dying oaks on the outside where it's working its way into the live oaks there. It's caused by a fungus, and you can see the fungal mat under the bark in the picture on the far right. And these pockets do expand, and there's 3 ways it can happen. The fungus moves into nearby healthy oaks through root grafts. Insects can carry the fungus to wounded oaks up to a quarter mile away, and it can be carried by humans into new areas. So this can be the long distance transport of the fungus, and this would be in fresh oak wilt infested logs and fresh oak wilt infested firewood. Here's a map of the counties where oak wilt is present in 2013. And I just have some ideas for you here if you do live in one of these colored counties where oak wilt is present. Contact a forester if you suspect oak wilt and you want to manage your oak for recommendations. From April 1st to July 15th, do not cut or thin your oaks. Do not create roads through oaks or prune oaks. You'll be just opening up your oaks for invasion by oak wilt fungus. Make sure that all your fresh oak logs are used by April 1st the next year, and then you won't be spreading it where the fresh oak logs have been moved to. And do not move oak firewood from the stand until it has seasoned for more than a year. This will help the recipients of all the firewood that you have, and you won't be spreading oak wilt around. The next causal agent that I'd like to talk about is black ash decline. Last year, pardon me, we had 30,000 acres of crown dieback and mortality, as you can see, distributed quite widely throughout the state. It's entirely site-related. It's a physiological response to the up and down water movement of the water in the water table. And we do manage it by focusing on the declining ash and by not harvesting those sites. Harvesting of these sites makes these sites vulnerable to conversion to cattails and other wetlands. So we're really not excited about people harvesting on these sites. The other thing that we need to think about is that it's not EAB, but it does look like the early phases of what EAB looks like in black ash, say in Ohio and Indiana. So just be aware of that possibility. I'm going to move on to the conifers now and talk about tamarack first and eastern larch beetle. You can see the picture of larch beetle in the upper left, and you can see the gray dead trees, the rim of yellow trees that are currently under attack, and the green trees that are not attacked yet. It's a native bark beetle. It mines the inner bark, and the larvae overwinter under the bark. So this time of year, the picture to the lower left is a picture of what the piles of bark underneath or on top of the snow now show you that the birds have been active in the tree, pecking away at the larvae and getting a lot of good nutrition from that after the tree has pretty much killed the tree. The good news in the tamarack, if there is any, is that the younger tamarack trees are not being attacked. This is a cumulative mortality picture, and we've got about 185,000 acres of tamarack with mortality. And it's the first widespread outbreak recorded outside of Alaska and Nova Scotia. It's the first continental outbreak, a mid-continent, that has ever occurred in recorded history, in the scientific history. Almost 20% of the tamarack in Minnesota has been killed since 2000. And the University of Minnesota, Dr. Akama's lab, is currently conducting research on this outbreak. They've found that it's related to climate change. Primarily, longer summers are allowing an additional generation to mature and mate, and milder winters are allowing more beetles to survive the winters. Moving to balsam fir and white spruce forests, I'd like to talk about spruce budworm. You can see the map at the top here showing a defoliation acres and a mortality acreage. This particular pest is primarily active in the Arrowhead region, and it causes perennial defoliation and widespread mortality here. And it's unlike anywhere else on the continent. And you can see the picture in the upper right-hand corner showing affected balsam fir and white spruce, along with the really super green aspen up in the corner. And you can see the little inset there shows what a dead balsam fir looks like from the ground. Basically, defoliation occurs for many, many years, like 10 years or more, and that pretty much wipes out the balsam fir in an area, and it recycles it to more balsam fir. And you can see we've had, we're kind of at the down slump of mortality, new mortality, and that usually indicates that it's moving off into a newer area, and it might be moving down into that Two Harbors area, the junction between St. Louis County and Lake County. I'd like to next move to jack pine and jack pine budworm. This is a native defoliator of jack pine, and it rarely, but it does move to red pine. There are cyclic outbreaks lasting up to 3 years in a location, and it commonly causes mortality in older or drought-stressed trees. And what happens with jack pine budworm is that multiple outbreaks over a tree's lifetime does shorten the tree's life. And what we found is that jack pine in the northwestern counties don't live as long as they do in the Northeast due to jack pine budworm primarily, and also fire history and droughty soils. So you can see the last outbreak occurred, the peak of the last outbreak occurred in 2005, and we're just picking up jack pine budworm again this year in 2013, and we had 324 acres in 2 spots just east of Badura Nursery. And so what I've also set here is a map showing the average time between outbreaks, and you can see in the green area the central, west central counties, that the average outbreak occurs every 8 years. In the northeast part of the state, the average outbreak occurs every 24 years, and then the Baudette-Roseau area up there, they get jack pine budworm about every 12 years, so there's a, sort of an intermediate step in that particular part of the country. But for the area, the west central counties, the DNR forestry is suggesting a rotation age of 45 to 55 years based on the severity of the jack pine budworm impacts. And the last pest that I'm going to be talking about is bark beetles in red pine plantations. Bark beetles mine the inner bark of pines, and they too can only attack stressed pine trees. I think one of the very significant things that they do is they carry the blue stain fungi, which reduces the saw log value by 2/3 if you harvest during the wrong time of year. And I'll show you in a slide or two what we can do about it. The outbreaks last 2 years. They're very localized, but they can cause significant losses. And prevention is best, as there is no way for us to shut down an outbreak once it has started. The 2 pictures on the left, to complete their life cycle and get into outbreak mode, pine bark beetles require freshly cut slash, as you can see in the picture, the top picture, or pine trees that are wounded, drought stressed, freshly killed, or you could have storm damaged trees, or, as the bottom picture depicts, the fresh log decks. And they can build up in these things and then move into live nearby trees that you were hoping were your next crop trees. The other thing I'd like you to recall is that once the habitat, which is the inner bark, dries out, discolors or ferments, usually has a smell, bark beetles will not use it or reuse it. So those pieces of wood or logs or slash are not going to be recolonized, and they are not going to be a problem anymore for bark beetles. And so my last slide, I'm going to give you a few prevention techniques for bark beetles. And this applies to thinning in pines, to road building through pines, construction operations near pines, and also to blowdown events in pine stands and plantations during any time of the year. First of all, have your operator, whatever type of operation you're having, agree to avoid wounding the living residual trees. If you've talked about it with the person, it's much more likely to happen that you're going to have nice unwounded trees. The other thing you want to know is that the small slash, smaller than 2 to 3 inches in diameter, can be left in the stand if it's scattered and not piled. And what we're trying to do is to dry it out, so do not lop off the green branches, and it will not be a bark beetle threat. So I've got 3 plans here for you. Plan A is the safest and easiest. This is something you can do for 7 months of the year. So slash and products produced from August 1 to about March 1. All the cut pine material greater than 3 inches and the pine logs must be removed from the site before April 1st, and you will not have a bark beetle problem on the site. Plan B, this is risky. This is for bark beetles and the blue stain of the cut products, because we're moving into the growing season here. If cutting occurs from March 1 to June 1, you want to do this. All the cut pine material greater than 3 inches and pine logs must be removed or destroyed by June 1st. And Plan C, of course, is a very, very, very risky. And so if you're cutting in the middle of summer here, basically the height of summer, from June 1 to August 1, all cut pine material 3 inches and larger and pine logs must be removed or destroyed within 3 weeks of being created. That's a really tough thing to do, and it's actually a big burden on the operator that you're working with in your pine stands. Well, I've just given you a quick look at most of the common and troublesome pests that we have in Minnesota, and now I invite your questions if Eli thinks we have time to do so.
Jana, yes, we do have time, but I'm going to change things up a little bit here because I've got a technical issue here in St. Paul. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, Jana, to keep an eye on the chat pod. We only have one question right now, and I'm going to feed questions to you kind of sequentially. So if you can watch the chat pod, you'll see me give you questions. So don't worry, you don't have to scroll back to see a question submitted 10 minutes ago. But the first one, which I just posted to the chat pod, is does black ash decline make stands more susceptible to EAB? And what I need to do is mute myself so that we don't get that echo. So I'm going to ask you again. I see a couple more questions coming in, so why don't you just watch, and as you're wrapping up an answer, I'll feed you a new question.
Thank you. Okay, EAB is not particular. It does not need a stressed host. It loves healthy trees just as much as it loves the stress trees. So there's no preferential in attacking, but the stress trees are going to die quicker. Okay, Steve, it says, I have used the trap tree method and it worked well. Is it still recommended? Are you talking about bark beetles in pine? I'll wait for the answer. The trap tree method is when you you purposely leave logs during the growing season in the area where you're thinning or working or doing some construction. Go back in, and before the insects mature and fly away from the logs and then into your trees, those are debarked or destroyed or burned, something like that. Yes, that is still a very, very valid method. It works very well. There are some big drawbacks to it, primarily because of people losing those logs once the underbrush grows up, if there is any, and then you've just magnified your problem and you've got a full-blown bark beetle outbreak because you forgot a few logs in the woods. So for some people it would work very well if they've got equipment, or if your logger can do that for you if they want to come back. But and we have information on that on our website too. So yes, there is a map of the bark beetle. It says, is there a map of pine bark beetle outbreak? And we are also concerned about winter stress on pine. Yes, we had, there is a map in the January 2014 newsletter, and you can look at that. Typically, we have 500 to 1,000 acres in just a general year for that die due to bark beetles. And also concerned about the winter stress on pine. We have had another a long drawn-out winter where there was plenty of wind and drying weather to dry out the needles on the pine trees, particularly, and the other conifers. They particularly desiccate the new needles. And those tend to go brown and dry, but the buds remain alive for the most part, especially the leaders, and the tree, 99% of the time lives. So it's not a big problem in terms of mortality, but in terms of visual qualities, it can be a problem. And we do not map that. Jana, we are also wondering about the polar vortex and the cold tolerance of these forest pests. Well, there is a lot of work being done at the University of Minnesota in Rob Vanette's lab, and I guess I would have you look at some of his work there. If you can look at it, it's Vanette, V-E-N-E-T-T-E, and he's been doing work on the freezing points of some of these insects. Some of the natives that we're been talking about, like forest tent caterpillar, I believe can go down to minus 42 Fahrenheit. We don't hit that all that often, and this particular insect is distributed all the way up to Hudson Bay and all the way down to Mississippi, so, and out to the East Coast. So it's a very well adapted native insect. And let's see, and then for example, they've been looking at EAB in their lab, and they have found that as it gets colder and colder, EAB viability decreases, and that could be a help. Maybe up here in northern Minnesota, maybe in Canada, it would be more successful up there. It just depends on the strength of the winter and what the actual wood temperature is, not the air temperature. So I'll just stop there. Okay. Will forest tent caterpillar feed on ash? It will feed on ash, but it really prefers the aspen, birch, oak, and basswood. The only thing that it really doesn't feed on is red maple. The question, there are many young white pine trees that have turned brown. Will they recover? Is this sun scald? Excuse me, I have a phone call. Can you hang it up? Will they recover? And is this sun scald? Yes, they will recover for the most part. This is the winter drying that we've been talking about. And typically, if they're near a roadway, they do suffer from salt damage also.
All right, I'm going to move on now to Angie. Jana, that was an excellent talk as always. Thank you very much for the talk and the responses to the questions. Now I'm going to change the look here, and if folks have additional questions for Jana, and I do see one or two coming in now, that's fine. We'll try to bring Jana in again at the end to see if we can have her address those. We'll see how the time goes. Next up is Angie Gupta. So Jana just told us what's in the woods now based on aerial survey results and other sources. Now Angie's going to talk about what may be coming. Angie is an extension educator with the University of Minnesota based in Rochester. Angie, I'm going to mute my mic and Ron.
Wonderful. I think you guys should be able to hear me. So yeah, I'm going to talk about forest invasive species issues really as they pertain to us. And I realize we are all across the state, so forgive me. Some of the folks in the southeast are going to be a little bored by a few of these species, but those in the north, hopefully it'll be new. So first, we're going to go right away into sort of some nasty players, and this is basically an outline of the agenda. We're going to start out with gypsy moth, with tied well into one of the questions about the status of gypsy moth. Then move on to emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, buckthorn for those of you up north, garlic mustard for those of you up north, and oriental bittersweet for hopefully quite a few people. So first, right away with the gypsy moth quarantine. So gypsy moth is an unfortunate bug that has been around for a long time. Here are your pictures, of the the caterpillar and then the moth, but it's a really big issue right now in Minnesota because of the potential quarantine in Cook and Lake counties. And so this is still a proposed quarantine. There is not an official quarantine. As a consequence, I cannot look at the official quarantine regulations. It does, at this point, the folks I know at the MDA, it may not be the federal quarantine, though. Minnesota may choose a less stringent variety of quarantine than the federal one, which has its own interesting repercussions. But generally, there are some important points to note. My symbols at the top are not just goofy clip art. These are all intended to tell you how these pests move around. And so gypsy moth, we know it can move in recreational vehicles, on camping equipment, all kinds of stuff like that. We also know it's very efficient at moving in firewood. And quite frankly, the reason the Arrowhead has so much gypsy moth right now is that we know the larvae, these caterpillars right here, actually blew across Lake Superior from Michigan and Wisconsin, and they then established along the coast in Cook and Lake counties. And so it was a wind-blown event that created a really mass introduction of gypsy moth larvae. And so it's important to know the introduction points, and then you can work on your management and your surveys and early detection work. And so a quick summary of the proposal. The MDA is still kind of hashing through the details at public forums and whatnot. So keep an eye on the Minnesota Department of Ag. This is the link to their information right there. And I'm sure it will make the news as soon as it comes out, what the quarantine will be. It could be quite restrictive. So the federal quarantine would restrict movement of any materials, essentially any wood material at all. That's firewood, that's Christmas trees, that's pretty much anything, roundwood, live trees, and below ground material, and a great deal of recreational equipment moving in and out, so camping gear and stuff like that. It looks like Minnesota's will not be quite as restrictive, however, so pros and cons to that. Couple of points about gypsy moth, though, more generally. So a couple of key identification points. The females here, they do not fly. They're very heavy with their egg sacs, and so you'll never see them flying around. These are the females right here laying these egg sacs on the trees. These egg sacs are what actually move around really efficiently on vehicles, RVs, things like that. The gypsy moth itself, while the caterpillars can blow, the females aren't going very far. The males aren't flying super far distances, but these egg sacs getting dispersed as we move our gear around can be very problematic. The males are daytime flyers, so this is somewhat unusual for moths, but they can be seen during the daytime, and they have some very distinctive commas right here. This can be a good indicator that you have a gypsy moth around. I'm not going to talk about management for these things. You can go to, I'll talk about resources in a bit, but to the MDA, Minnesota Department of Ag, or to Extension's My Minnesota Woods website for additional resources on all of these. So here's a couple of identifying characteristics for the caterpillars. So kind of the general rule of thumb is caterpillars will emerge as soon as oak leaves are the size of squirrel ears, so pretty early in the spring, and they start out very, very small, and as they grow into various instars, they will get larger. Very diagnostic. They have 5 pairs of blue dots on the top half of their body, followed by 6 pairs of red dots on the bottom. That would be very diagnostic of gypsy moth. Going to move kind of right along to emerald ash borer. I apologize, this is the date for this map. It just didn't cooperate very well. But you've seen, emerald ash borer before. I'm sure you've seen that. These are the larvae of emerald ash borer, which you can find in the wood any time of year, so including in firewood in the winter. I'm sure you're well aware we have emerald ash borer quarantines on in Hennepin and Ramsey County, and then in Minnesota and Houston and Winona County Southeast. You probably all heard last fall they found emerald ash borer in Superior, Wisconsin, so right across the border from Duluth. And that is a point of much concern for all folks in Duluth and up in that area. There's a lot of surveying right now for emerald ash borer, trying to find if it is in Duluth. They're trying to locate that. And then if that were to happen, what we have seen down here is quarantines would ensue quickly. I don't know what will happen up there. It will be interesting to see how that plays out, particularly as it overlaps potentially with some gypsy moth quarantines. But we haven't found it, so there's no quarantine movement right now. I love this photo. If you haven't seen it before, I highly recommend it as a photo. It is a photograph. These are all pinned insects, so these are not drawings or anything, which means they are all to scale to one another. This is emerald ash borer right here. It has some native cousins, bronze birch borer and two-line chestnut borer, which are very similar. They're in the same family. You can see they're a little smaller, but they do look very similar. And then all of these other things are things that the public has called in concern they had emerald ash borer. So if you get calls or comments from the public about, oh, I have emerald ash borer, and then they show you, this is very common to be shown a six-spotted tiger beetle. This is a nice resource because it can help you narrow down what people might be talking about when they've potentially misidentified emerald ash borer. But the truth of the matter is we would much prefer people report all of these pests to us and be wrong than not report one that is correct. All reporting happens at the Minnesota Department of Ag Arrest the Pest website. Again, resources will be available at the end. And I see that Eli's putting them into the chat box as well. So quick symptomology, you guys have probably all heard this before. Emerald ash borer will lay eggs on ash bark and then bore underneath the larval galleries will be formed by the larvae, and this is essentially what kills the tree. It does not impact wood quality for resale value or something, but it does kill the tree, 99% mortality. This is what we see typically in large infestations. These are smaller infestations, not quite as dense. You can see the D-shaped exit hole where the beetle, mature beetle, will emerge. You can see it can be a little deeper in the wood, and so it doesn't go into the wood itself, but it can be deeper than just below the bark. So it's important to recognize that. This picture back here is in black ash. So when you have emerald ash borer and black ash, you can get these, instead of the classic S-shaped squiggles that are a little tighter, you can get these really long lines back and forth. And we don't exactly know why, but that is fairly diagnostic in black ash of emerald ash borer. And again, you can see these galleries any time of year, whether the tree is dead or alive, if it's intact or if it's firewood. These larval galleries can be fairly definitive so long as you have ash. So you have to have ash first. Ooh. And then a few resources. I'm not going to go into details, but we do have a good resource. This one, if you are a homeowner and you're worried about individual trees, this insecticidal option. And then this is the ash management guide for forest landowners, which talks through ash management by ecosystem for the 5 major ecosystems in Minnesota that have ash. These are both available on My Minnesota Woods. All right, now we're going to move on to Asian longhorn beetle. This is a critter we don't think we have and we really, really don't want. And I'll talk a little bit about why in a moment. As with so many of our pests, we have the potential to move it in wood. That's how it gets around. And really, it has been found at a variety of ports, coming in most likely in pallet material when we do international commerce. And so it has been found repeatedly. It is a good-sized bug. And we'll see some pictures of its exit holes and whatnot. So it's easy to spot. It's not a great flyer. It's not super mobile. It's mobile, but it's not really good at moving around. But it has been introduced to the United States kind of repeatedly and only become established in a relatively few number of places. But the problem, so here's the size. So this is an inch right here. This is an inch right here. You can set a pencil. Do I have that picture? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had another picture. A pencil can actually fit in the diameter of this hole right here. So there was a landowner report out east that said he called the local city forester and said, someone has been vandalizing my tree. They've been drilling holes in it. And the forester went out and looked at it, and it wasn't someone vandalizing their tree. It was this bug. It was Asian longhorn beetle exiting the tree. And another thing that this shows well in this picture is Asian longhorn beetle is not limited to the outer bark of a tree or to the first, half inch to an inch of the inner of the bark or the wood of the tree. Asian longhorn beetle will move right through the center of the tree. So it has only about a 30% mortality rate in a lot of its host species, which I'll see in a minute. But what it does do is it really degrades the structural integrity of a tree. So in a snowstorm or an ice storm, the tree it's now riddled with these hollow galleries, and so it just can't hold up as well. And so you see a lot more trees coming down, even if they're not completely dead, they just can't stand up to the elements anymore. This is the problem with Asian longhorn beetle. Compared to things like emerald ash borer, which is confined to just ash trees, Asian longhorn beetle is really kind of a a broad pest. It will go off a whole bunch of things, but some big ones are maple, willow, elm, birch, hackberry, and then the poplars, so aspen. Now, not as much here, but the problem with Asian longhorn beetle is while quarantines have been quite effective, this is a lot of species to have to cut down in order to implement a quarantine. And so where it has been most effective is where they have been found very early on. So where Asian longhorn beetle have been found when there's only a few trees impacted, they can do a full quarantine, and they've been successful at eradication. I think that's the next slide. And so that's the good news with Asian longhorn beetle, is it can be eradicated. I kind of apologize. I think I forgot to say the hosts for gypsy moth, but gypsy moth also has a huge variety of hosts. The vast majority of our deciduous trees, it's a defoliator, so it will eat the foliage of those trees. It will then, when desperate, go after some of our conifers as well. So gypsy moth is another really vigorous defoliating insect that is not specific, which is part of its challenge. All right, so for those folks up north, I added this for you. For the folks down south, I apologize for the repetition, I'm sure. But buckthorn is a huge plant problem down here and in central Minnesota. And if you're up north, you have an opportunity to get it early and maybe not have the same landscape level problem we have. But this is a picture of buckthorn right here. Buckthorn is the entire understory of what was before probably an oak or oak savanna stand. And it has these nice berries. Birds are very effective distributors of buckthorn. This is how it gets around. The birds love the berries, but it gives them diarrhea and they poop it out and more buckthorn grows. Interestingly, it is also the alternate host for soybean aphid, another invasive species that's a real agricultural pest. If we didn't have those two invasive species together, they couldn't have the complex which makes soybean aphid successful. So it's kind of an unfortunate characteristic. The other thing is buckthorn in Europe can become a tree. It's a large plant. It's not just a shrub. I think we often think of it as a shrub. And so I really worry down here we are going to get buckthorn as a predominant understory species that will become a dominant overstory species. And I don't think that's what we want. And so anywhere you don't have it as a major issue, my recommendation would be to plan right now to remove it and to really actively jump on that. And removal it's cutting and a treatment, some sort of herbicidal application. Traditionally, it's a cut stump treatment. So you have some choices the earlier you get it. Once it becomes endemic and well established, you still have to manage it, but it's just a lot more intensive. Here is another great picture. So this is all buckthorn in the understory. And you see there's no opportunity for native vegetation to grow here, and it will become so dense eventually that even wildlife won't go through it. And again, I don't think we have a clear handle on. It's not a shrub. It's not going to just sort of go away or just manipulate the understory. I think it really can become an overstory species, and so that's problematic. All right, another one which if you're in southern Minnesota, you know well, and if you're in northern Minnesota, maybe you don't, but that's garlic mustard. This is a plant. It's a biennial. It takes 2 years to develop. The first year it looks like a rosette. It looks a lot like creeping Charlie or violet to me, but these are individual little rosettes. And then it's in the second year that it bolts, so it grows really quickly, and it has these really nice, beautiful little white flowers, very obvious in May and sometimes early June. And then right after that, it produces these seed heads, which are very effective at seed production. And then you end up with this whole understory of garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an unfortunate pest because it can take over entirely intact and healthy forest understories. Now, it's just an herbaceous plant, so it's not going to take over the overstory, but it will take over the understory. And it's allelopathic, like walnut, and so it will actually manipulate the soil chemistry. And so even if you had an intact forest, understory with beautiful spring ephemerals, native wildflowers, things like that, you get garlic mustard in there, and it will literally change the soil chemistry, take over entirely until you get 100% monoculture of garlic mustard. So in addition to it just being a bugger of a pest, I am under the opinion, personally, I haven't seen this in literature, but that when we get these really huge rain events, particularly on the hills of southeastern Minnesota, these seeds are moving in those overland water events, so they're just flowing with the water in those big rain events and spreading these seeds around, which is why I have the cloud up here. Another really common point of introduction for this is with people, movement along trails and roadways, just inadvertently moving it as we hike through, get mud on our boots, and move seeds around. So this is a big problem. Again, the management for this is really yanking it out. There is an herbicidal possibility depending upon your density levels, but it's another bugger. So if you don't have it and it's considered an early detection species for you, I would look for it very religiously and repeatedly, and then manage it when it's in very small pockets. And so here's another nice picture of these really noticeable flowers in early spring. That's when it's most easy to ID and you can get rid of it. This is just before it has flowered, and you can see it's already a clear understory. And here's a picture of that entirely infested understory. Beautiful overstory, but there's nothing residual in that understory but garlic mustard. Oriental bittersweet is the last pest I'm going to talk about. This is a major problem in a couple of areas, southeast Minnesota and the Twin Cities. You can see the berries in this vine right here. This is a major issue because it's an invasive plant. It's a vine. This is an interesting sculpture. This is the bittersweet vine. And so you can see that is a very vigorous and woody vine. It's large. It wraps around. It is a substantial plant. It moves very commonly with birds. Again, they eat these seeds and they move it all around that way. So if you have it and you want to get rid of it now, a couple of identifying characteristics here. So here's another great picture. This was actually a roadway up in the Twin Cities. It's been taken care of now. This is all Oriental bittersweet. In the summer, this is a spruce tree. You can't really tell, but I promise you underneath there is a spruce tree. And right here, this is in a cemetery, next to a cemetery in Red Wing, Minnesota. And you can see where this vine wraps right around. So it doesn't have tendrils like you would have in poison ivy or woodbine or Virginia creeper. This one rather acts like a boa constrictor, and it really has to kind of wrap around and squeeze onto that tree in order to support itself to get up to the canopy. Oriental bittersweet will go to about 66 feet, so the height of our trees, all the way up to the canopy, and just really aggressive growth. So this will kill the tree a couple of ways. It will girdle the tree, right? You can see that with this serious growth. It will also kill the tree by overtaking the foliage and essentially prohibiting photosynthesis, right? So no sun will actually reach the tree anymore. So both big issues. And then, as you can maybe imagine here, and my next... Well, maybe not. So when you get a big ice or snowstorm on top of this, all of these vines plus the weight of the ice or snow will cause the trees to come down. And so we have really big infestations in Winona and Red Wing, many acres. And I just heard about one at Three Rivers Parkway. They have 14 acres that's all covered in bittersweet. And so the forest in those 14 acres really is no longer. The trees have tipped over. It's entirely bittersweet now. And so this is a real problem. Now, we have an American bittersweet, which is a very nice plant. It's beautiful, it's non-problematic, and so we don't want to pull American bittersweet while we're removing Oriental bittersweet. So a couple of key distinguishing characteristics. So Oriental bittersweet has these yellow seed capsules, whereas American bittersweet has orange seed capsules. So a quick and easy way to remember that is orange is okay, yellow you give a yell. Another couple of really nice characteristics, all with the fruit, these are all fruit characteristics, are American bittersweet, the berries clump at the end of the branch, a little bit like grape, so there'll be a clump at the end. Unlike Oriental, which has berry production all the way along the stem, that is definitive. And so you can have berries up and down on all the way along the stem, and you have Oriental bittersweet. Interestingly, the leaf characteristics are not a good way to identify bittersweet. They're very abnormal. They're not very consistent at all. So you really want to look for both the fruit and the flowering. The flowers will have this same characteristic, and then that in American they'll be clustered at the tip, and in Oriental the flowers will be distributed all along the stem. So I want to give just a moment to pathways, because I think this is really important as we consider early detection of these invasive pests. We have a lot of invasive pests on the horizon, some closer than others. And if we understand the pathways, I think we have a better chance of finding them quickly and managing them quickly. So let's talk about that. So I mentioned that gypsy moth flew across, literally blew in with the wind across Lake Superior, and that's exactly how those caterpillars arrive. So we know that that can happen. There's not a ton we can do about that, but we can monitor after big wind events with various life stages of various insects that we're concerned about, and really ramp up our monitoring to see if it's around. Another one is that, of course, many of these insects are mobile in some way, shape, or form. Emerald ash borer, gypsy moth males, they do get around, typically not nearly as far as we as humans will move them, but they get around. So you have to kind of know that and know kind of their preferred habitats and places in order to pay close attention to that. Then, of course, we have wildlife and birds that move all kinds of seeds. A lot of our plants move quite efficiently with bird distribution, and this is what happens, right? The birds poop out the seeds and then things grow. This is intended to be an Orono bittersweet vine. But if you know that, then you can look for where birds congregate, forest edges. If you have bluebird boxes, we know that Orono bittersweet can be found more at bluebird boxes because presumably the bluebirds bring them back and they poop them out of their boxes and then they grow. But this gives you a heads up when you're looking for monitoring and management. So where to really put your energy, where to put your eggs in your basket. But then, of course, we have human-caused movement, and this is the most efficient way by which these pests get around. And here are some good examples. There's a whole bunch of ways that these critters can move around. So here we have walnut. I did not talk about, I considered it, but we're really concerned about thousand cankers disease. That's a disease in walnuts. We have an external quarantine on Minnesota, so you cannot move walnut into the state of Minnesota on account of thousand cankers disease. And so that can move right there in the bark. It's a little tiny bug, and it moves really efficiently around. And kind of sadly, it is now illegal with our external quarantine to bring wood in, but quite frankly, you can Google it and see it for sale online all the time. So this is a concern for us. And if you're going to be moving things around, it'd be great if everyone could think about that more critically. Minnesota Department of Transportation has done some good work about how much seed they move on their equipment, and the truth of the matter is it's quite a bit. Particularly with things like wild parsnip, we know we can really manage that better by picking the times that we mow. So specifically when the seed is not mature, you can make a big difference in not moving stuff around. This is a picture from Play Clean Go, a new campaign, essentially a new program at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources to really get people to consider, right, go into our woods, play, then clean off all your gear, and then go. And that's an idea about really reducing the spread of these invasive species. And this picture, of course, meant to show people moving around in their boots and whatnot. This is Orono bittersweet in decorations. This is a common item to use in Christmas decorations. I think it is not a coincidence that that large vine in Red Wing was at a cemetery. It was most likely that someone left a beautiful bouquet, included Orono bittersweet, and then the birds ate it and it escaped into the woodlands. So we need to think about that. It is now illegal to sell bittersweet, Orono bittersweet, in the state of Minnesota. So hopefully that's been curtailed. We have been trying to work with crafters to make sure that they're using American bittersweet and not Oriental. But alas, we still see these things around. And then you guys have probably all heard, but firewood and wood movement in general is a huge vector for a ton of pests. So if you are working at a campground or near a recreational facility that gets a lot of summer recreationalists, you would want to pay special attention to that location for all of these invasive species because of the firewood introduction, trail introduction, all those things. So, you'd want to really prioritize those areas. And finally, I promised you some resources. This is the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's website for all your quarantine information for these really early detection pests. They're the place to go for that information, and then they have it by species and whatnot, so it's pretty well done. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources also has a ton of invasive species, terrestrial invasive species information, and so you want to make sure you check that out, particularly if you're up north and you've heard about some problem we have down south. Almost guaranteed to have information about that here. But I am very biased to, I'm sorry, I forgot this one. So there are also ways in which you can report these early detection ones, particularly the insects I talked about. And you can do that through the Forest Pest First Detector website. There's an online reporting tool that you can use. You can also use that same tool to report using your smartphone. It can take your GPS coordinates and a digital photo and a little bit of information right there in the field, so you wouldn't need to remember all of that. You could do that. And you can find that at My Minnesota Woods. So if you're not familiar with the My Minnesota Woods website, this is a site that Eli Stegler runs. then I would seriously recommend you go and look at that website. It has a ton of these informations, and it's cross-referenced to the MDA and to the DNR, so you wouldn't miss anything if you started there. So with that, I think I'm at my time allotment, and I will take questions. So I'm going to go to the questions section. I haven't heard Eli chime in here. So a question from Boulder: what role do off-road vehicles have? Have they been studied? Yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't know, have they been studied? I can't answer that. We do worry about them for sure as a vector for plant, particularly plant seed movement, and they would fall in the same category as pretty much anything. Horses, dogs, people, anything that's moving through the woods is going, almost inevitably going to be moving seed around. And so the message to those folks would be to clean your gear before you leave anywhere. So whether you're leaving the site that you've been recreating on or you're leaving your house, make sure your gear is clean when you leave, so that when you arrive, it is clean when you get there. Then you go and you go and recreate, you go four-wheeling, and then you clean it again before you leave the site. So anything that you would have picked up on those trails should stay on those trails. And so that's what we would ask of everyone. But it would be the same with horseback riders and anything else. And so for Plate Clean Go, they've been giving out a lot of boot brushes, which are really horse picks for horse hoof picks. But the idea is that you can pick out the dirt and you can rub off your boots and then you don't move it around. And the Minnesota Department of Transportation has done a fair bit of research on what their equipment moves around, also what their employees move around. And so they're really trying to crack down on that. It all inadvertently, but alas, we don't want that to happen. So there was a question here: EAB caused 99% mortality. Which 1% is spared? Isolated trees, there is no resistance, correct? All good questions, and yeah, there was some research being done out of Michigan to figure out what was spared, and quite frankly, I haven't heard the result of that. Part of the problem was they have to wait long enough to see if it's really spared or if they're kind of the most resistant, akin to when Jana was talking about oak wilt. So oak wilt is it's got a very quick mortality rate for red oaks, but a much slower one for white oaks. And so what the folks studying EAB resistance in ash weren't sure if it was just a few trees had a greater resistance, so it took them longer to die, or if they were truly resistant and weren't going to succumb. And so as a consequence, I have not seen the results of that research to see if we really do have native resistance. They have been working on resistance in the lab, but it's pretty long and arduous process, so I don't know that we've gotten to a point like with American chestnut that we're going to be having resistant ashes anytime in our seed pool. All right. I'm going to mute the mic because Jana has something to say.
Is this mine now? I missed a little bit here. There was a question: how can you tell the difference between wind damage and salt damage? In conifers, it looks very, very similar. It's going to be desiccation, and that's going to be the needle symptoms. The other thing that you're going to notice in more of a neighborhood kind of look, you're going to have wind damage will be over the entire area, whereas salt damage is usually worst, closest to the roads, and then dissipates out to not even being existent at about 150 feet. The other thing is that salt damage can occur on hardwoods too, and you have death. You'll have actually more death of the buds and foliage. On some conifer trees, salt damage over a period of years will kill most of the bottom branches, and you'll just have higher up branches, even though there might be adequate sunlight in the situation against the road.